Hello and welcome to this lesson on the origins of the United Nations. This is the final topic of the P1 paper on the League of Nations for the AS Syllabus International option. The objectives of today's class will be to develop an understanding of the origins of the United Nations. That will involve first of all, understanding the role of the American President Roosevelt in the creation of the UN. Second of all, how the creators of the UN hoped to avoid the mistakes of the League of Nations. Thirdly, how the United Nations Charter was created, the process through which it was created, which culminated at the San Francisco Conference in 1945. And finally, understanding the similarities and differences between the UN and the League of Nations itself. To understand the origins of the United Nations, we have to go back to the beginning of the Second World War. The outbreak of the Second World War was in 1939, as you guys will recall, with the German invasion of Poland, which led to a declaration of war on Germany by Britain and France. The war initially did not go well for the Allies. By the end of 1940, Germany had defeated France, and as you can see from this map, dominated most of the rest of Europe, with some countries remaining neutral. And really the only holdout in Europe that was opposing the Germans and Germany's Axis allies was Great Britain over here. In 1941, Germany would invade the USSR, which would bring the USSR into the war. And at the end of 1941, December 1941, Germany's ally Japan would invade the United States. And so bringing the US into the war as well, which meant that by the end of 1941, Britain was no longer alone. It had two other great powers on its sides, and that was the USA and the USSR. Collectively, these three countries were referred to as the Big Three, and they were led respectively. Britain was led by Prime Minister Winston Churchill. The United States was led by President Roosevelt, and the Soviet Union was led by Stalin. What's interesting is that even before America's entry to the war, Roosevelt had become convinced that the US would have to participate in this war. And he had started to take measures such as providing aid, economic and military aid, to Britain, and then later on to Russia as well, even before America entered the war. The problem for America, of course, was that the public was very strongly isolationist, and didn't really want to have much to do with the rest of the world. So he couldn't enter the war directly. However, he did believe that eventually America would have to enter the war. As a result, even before America's entry into the war, Roosevelt was thinking about what the world would look like after the war ended. In January of 1941, Roosevelt gave a famous speech which is known as the Four Freedoms speech. In this speech, he really sort of laid out his vision for what the world should look like after the end of the war, one in which all people around the world universally should be guaranteed these four freedoms: the freedom of speech, the freedom of worship, the freedom from want, and the freedom from fear. The first two, I think, are fairly self-evident. Freedom from want, in other words, is sort of economic security, having sort of basic guaranteed standard of living or income. And the final one, freedom from fear, basic rights, freedom from arbitrary arrest and so forth, so that you don't sort of live in fear of a tyrannical regime. So these four freedoms would really kind of inform his vision of what the world should look like after World War II. And they would also kind of become the basis of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights that would be made after the formation of the UN. Now, when it comes to more specific war aims, Roosevelt again thought that he should learn from the mistakes of US President Wilson, the mistakes that had been made during the First World War. Roosevelt believed that one of Woodrow Wilson's major mistakes during World War I is that America had entered the war without any kind of agreement between the US and its allies about what they were fighting for, what their war aims were. Wilson had issued his 14 points. However, the British and the French, the Russians had never signed on to or agreed to the 14 points. And as a result, when the war was over and the Paris Peace Conference met, there was, very little agreement about what the final peace treaty should look like, and a lot of arguing and haggling, and a peace treaty that pretty much everyone was kind of dissatisfied with in one way or the other. In order to avoid this, Roosevelt felt that this time around, before the US even enters the war, there should be some common set of aims. And in August of 1941, remember this is months before America has been attacked by Japan, and so months before America has entered the war, Roosevelt met with Winston Churchill, and they came up with this document, which was known as the Atlantic Charter. Now, the Atlantic Charter, without necessarily getting into the specifics, but it had a lot in common in principle with the 14 points of Woodrow Wilson. Roosevelt, like Wilson, was a liberal internationalist, and his ideas included things like, no territorial changes without the wishes of the population living there, disarmament of the aggressor powers, no, aggrandizement of territory, and free trade, and cooperation in the future, through setting up some kind of international organization. So the Atlantic Charter was agreed between Churchill and Roosevelt on August 1941. But soon, all the other countries that were part of the alliance against the Axis powers signed on to this Atlantic Charter. And that alliance of countries fighting against the Axis powers became known as the United Nations Alliance. And Roosevelt felt that it was very important that the big three get together and make decisions about what is going to happen after the war. During the war itself, they decided it's best not to wait, for a peace conference after the war is over. Some kind of decisions should be made beforehand, to try and avoid the kind of mess that happened at the Paris Peace Conference after World War I. So in October 1943, at the Moscow Declaration, the foreign ministers from all three great powers, the big three, declared their support for a new international organization. They agreed to set up a new international organization after the war was over. At the Tehran conference, where the leaders of the big three met in November 1943, they further agreed to set up meetings in which they would decide what this structure of this new organization would be. Meeting would happen at Dumbarton Oaks in October 1944, in which the countries the big three sort of hammered out what the structure of this new organization would look like. The final details, were then left for, the small issues that there wasn't quite agreement on were then sorted out in the conference between the big three leaders again at Yalta in March 1945. And only once they had agreed amongst themselves about what this new organization should look like, was a general conference held in which all the member countries of the United Nations Alliance were called, and it would end up being something like 50 countries. There they would finalize the Charter of the United Nations and sign it, thereby bringing the United Nations into existence. So another thing to note is, so this was the process by which the UN Charter was created. One thing to note is that during the course of the Second World War, while other functions of the League had pretty much been suspended, particularly when it came to diplomacy, peacemaking, and so on, but the social and humanitarian work of the League would continue throughout the Second World War. And in many ways, this was recognized to be the most successful aspect of the League's work. So we do see continuity between the League of Nations and the new organization that's set up, the United Nations. Many of these bodies are incorporated wholesale. They're just transferred from the League to the new organization. One example of an organization that is transferred from the League to the United Nations is the International Labour Organization, the ILO, which had continued to work during this time period. But it's also important to note that there wasn't just continuity between the League's social and humanitarian work. There was actually an expansion in the social and humanitarian work during World War II, and more task-oriented organizations were actually set up. International organizations were set up during the war, which would then be incorporated into the United Nations when it was created. And many of these organizations still exist today, such as the Food and Agricultural Organization, the UN Relief and Rehabilitation Administration, the UNESCO, IMF, World Bank, International Civil Aviation Organization. All of these still exist to this date. And they were set up actually before the UN itself was set up. They would be incorporated into the UN once it was created. So as I mentioned earlier, the two really important conferences when it comes to the creation of the UN. One is the Dumbarton Oaks Conference in October 1944. This is when officials and technical experts from the big three powers meet and kind of hammer out the structure and the details of what this new organization is going to look like. And then there is the San Francisco Conference, which is held in 1945, April, where the final charter of the UN is finalized. And in this meeting, it's not just the big three, it's all the initial signatory members of the UN, including many of the smaller powers as well. So one of the questions that arose was, how were they going to make sure that this new organization was not as ineffective as the previous organization, especially when it comes to collective security? Roosevelt had in his mind the idea that the great powers needed to play a particular special role in enforcing the decisions of the United Nations, and in particular enforcing collective security. For him, the great powers that were left after World War II would act as the policemen of the UN, the enforcers of the UN. So in his vision, this would be the United States, Great Britain, the USSR, and China. The three, what he thought of as great world powers, and China, which was not at that point, but he believed would eventually become a great power as well once it kind of modernized. So these four countries he felt needed to play a special role. He needed to make sure that they remained in this new organization, they remained committed to it, and they sorted out any possible issues and differences between themselves, so that once the UN is functioning, they would be there to make sure that its decisions were carried out. So what about the structure of this new organization? One of the things that the creators of the UN found was that the structure that they came up with was in many ways very similar to the structure of the League. For example, it had, just as the League had a Supreme Council, the United Nations would have a Security Council. This Security Council would make decisions about collective security, particularly when it comes to ensuring, maintaining, or enforcing peace. However, there were some differences between the League Supreme Council and the UN Security Council. One difference was that the decisions in the Security Council in the UN would be made by majority vote rather than by a unanimous vote, which was the case in the League Supreme Council. It was felt that this would mean that decisions would be quicker and easier to reach because you wouldn't need, a unanimous vote. At the same time, to ensure that the great powers remained within the UN, that they didn't walk out or leave or felt that their interests were being compromised, the permanent members were those four policemen, would have permanent seats, first of all, in the council, and then they would have a veto. So this was given to them so that they could ensure that their interests were protected, and they always had an interest and a stake in the UN and didn't just walk out like some of the great powers did with the League. In order to strengthen collective security, the decisions of the UN Security Council would be made binding on all members of the United Nations. The Security Council would make decisions on how members would contribute, and all members of the UN would have to contribute, whether it was to economic sanctions or military sanctions or in other ways. They weren't really given a choice about it. All right, so through this way, the designers of the UN hoped that collective security would be much stronger, much firmer, and that great power participation would be guaranteed, so that the UN would not be weakened or undermined in the way that the League was. What about the other organs of the UN? The General Assembly, much like the Supreme Council Assembly, was one where all members had a seat. It was one country, one vote, but again, decisions would be made by majority vote. And another way that this differed from the League was that the General Assembly and the Security Council would have their functions very clearly distinguished from each other. In the League, there was kind of an overlap about what both bodies could do, and it wasn't very clear who had responsibility for what. That was not the case here. And of course, the third major part of the United Nations, just like in the League, was the Secretariat, which functioned in a very similar way. Then there's the Court of Justice. Once again, the League had a permanent court, and the decision was made that the way it functioned was successful, and it was desirable to pretty much recreate or reproduce the League's permanent court in the UN. And that became the International Court of Justice. So this was set up in 1946, and it would comprise a panel of 15 judges elected by the General Assembly and Security Council for 9-year terms. So again, this was something that carried over. There was a lot of continuity between the ICJ and the League's permanent court. Well, then, what about the differences? One of the ways in which, again, one of the ways in which the creators of the UN hoped to make it more successful than the League was, first of all, the League had been created through a series of agreements, which were known as the Covenant, and these were attached to the Treaty of Versailles. They thought it best that the UN Charter be created separately from any kind of peace treaty. This is why the San Francisco Conference, where the UN Charter was created, was not part, it was not a part of the peace treaty or peace conference held after World War II. In fact, the war was still going on at that time. So they did not want the UN Charter to be necessarily associated with any peace treaty, because otherwise what would happen is that people who were unhappy with the peace treaty would immediately be unhappy with the organization as well. That is something that had happened with the League. Another thing that they did was, rather than just having a covenant, which is basically a set of agreements, yeah, we agree to do this, we agree to do this, the United Nations had a charter, and this it was felt would make it stronger and make the obligations of the countries stronger. A charter is a set of rules about how an organization is run. So it was much more clear that they are setting up a organization of which all countries are members, and they have obligations to fulfill, rather than just a set of agreements about how they will behave. One more body that kind of carries over, but under a different name, is the Old Mandates Commission, which is replaced by Trusteeship Council. The trusteeship system is similar to the mandate system. It was supposed to guarantee that appropriate measures were taken to prepare territories such as former colonies and underdeveloped or undeveloped areas, supposed to prepare them for autonomy or independence. And it's ceased functioning in 1994, when the last of its territories became independent. That was Palau in 1994. So let's have a quick think about Roosevelt's role in the creation of the United Nations. What role did Roosevelt play? Roosevelt really kind of plays a very key role in many ways. The first thing about Roosevelt is that he, in terms of his ideas, in terms of his policies and his thinking, he combined the liberal internationalism that Wilson had with something that Wilson was thought to have lacked, and that was pragmatism. Roosevelt was this interesting combination of idealism and realism. While he shared Wilson's ideals about how the international community could work, he was also more willing to make compromises with power politics in order to achieve what he thought were the bigger goals. His four freedoms would become the basis of the UN Declaration of Human Rights. His wartime diplomacy ensured that the great powers agreed on the idea of a new organization. They agreed on what it would look like, and they all agreed to participate in it. And so that was a very important step that he took. But if you remember, again, one of the problems going back to the League of Nations was that Wilson managed to convince his allies to set up the League of Nations, but he could not convince the American public and the American Senate to join it. And Roosevelt was again very much aware of this, and he very carefully handled public relations in the United Nations to try and overcome the sort of traditional American isolationism. He worked with opinion leaders, he worked with political leaders, church leaders, journalists, and so on, trying to convince them to support his call for an international organization. And it worked. A strongly isolationist American public came around to supporting the idea of a new organization. And there wasn't really any trouble in ratifying this new treaty. Roosevelt himself, however, did not live to see the United Nations come into being. He actually died before the San Francisco Conference would meet in April 1945. But he did play a very important role in making sure that it was set up. So let's quickly recap the similarities between the League and the United Nations. The first thing, of course, is that they had very similar aims. Collective security, peacekeeping, diplomacy, trying to sort of resolve misunderstandings, increasing international cooperation, and disarmament. And as a result, it had a very similar kind of structure. The UN had a very similar kind of structure to the League of Nations. There was a lot of continuity, particularly in its social and humanitarian work, and even the League's permanent court would go on to become the ICJ. So what about the differences? So when it comes to differences, first of all, there was a charter rather than a covenant. The idea was that this would be more binding than a covenant, though some historians feel that that's a very academic issue. The new organization was not associated with any particular peace treaty. Rather, it was created independently of a peace treaty. There was a much more clear distinction between the Security Council and General Assembly and what they were supposed to do, and what issues they dealt with. The General Assembly could deal with issues of peace and security, but only as recommendations. Otherwise, they also dealt with issues like budget, membership, and so on, whereas the Security Council dealt specifically with issues of international peace and security, and their decisions were binding. The way that the Charter was set up and the Security Council was set up collective security was really strengthened. When the League was set up after World War I, the feeling was that had better diplomacy taken place, then World War I could have been avoided. And the League kind of reflected this. However, when the UN is set up, the feeling was that stronger collective security could have avoided World War II. You know, if the dictators had been dealt with sternly earlier and in a more cooperative fashion by the great powers, then it wouldn't have been as such a massive war. And so the Charter reflected this. There would be no unanimous vote either in the General Assembly or in the Security Council. However, great powers did have a veto. This kind of gave a more privileged position to the great powers. These were initially the 4 policemen. This was expanded to 5 on Churchill's insistence. France was included. But again, the idea was that since these great powers would be enforcing collective security, and because they would be, it's important that they remain in the organization, that they would be allowed this privileged position. And finally, there was an even more expanded social and humanitarian role, though again, one can see this as a continuation of the work of the League, but more and specialized agencies were founded to implement it. All right, so thank you very much. That's the end of the class today. And thank you for listening.